One of the questions I'm asked over and over again is, why are you an advocate for people with HIV? You're a breast cancer survivor, melanoma survivor. Why aren't you an advocate for people with cancer? You were a victim of childhood sexual abuse. Why aren't you an advocate for women who've been abused? And those are great questions. So let me answer it, because if you're going to be an advocate for people with HIV and AIDS, you have to be able to explain why. So let me give you my 5 reasons why I am an advocate for people with HIV and why I think you should be as well. First of all, it's unpredictable. No one expects that the church will care about a sexually transmitted disease. I mean, the church has notoriously failed to talk about sex, let alone a sexually transmitted disease. There's a stigma attached to HIV, unlike any other disease. So when I was diagnosed with breast cancer, I never had to worry that when I came home that my husband would divorce me or beat me or make me leave our house. I didn't have to worry that our neighbors would decide that my kids couldn't play with their kids anymore. I didn't have to worry that I'd lose my job. I didn't have to worry that when I went to church there would be people who didn't want to sit by me anymore. But that happens every day for people who are diagnosed with HIV. On my first trip to Africa, I met a woman named Joanna, and I had wanted to meet people who were positive, so I thought I was going to go visit her in her house. Instead, we got in a car and we drove and came to this grove of trees. And we got out of the car and began to walk to this one tree, and I could see this brightly colored cloth under the tree, but I didn't know what I was looking at until I got closer. And when I got closer, I saw that that brightly colored cloth was on a very thin, emaciated, dying woman named Joanna. And the story about Joanna was that she and her husband were HIV positive, and when that was discovered, her village made her leave. They were afraid of her. But Joanna had an aunt in a distant village who agreed to take care of her and her husband. So Joanna and her husband took their meager belongings and moved to this other little village. But when that village found out that Joanna and her husband were positive, mysteriously, suddenly, her little tiny thatched roof hut was burned to the ground. So that when I met her, she was dying, unrelenting diarrhea, about a week away from death, no medication, nothing to ease her suffering. She was under a tree. And as I walked up to Joanna to greet her, her aunt took a piece of plastic and spread it down on the ground for us as the visitors to be able to sit on the ground next to her. And Joanna tried to get up from underneath the tree to come meet us, but she was so weak she collapsed on the ground, and she tried to crawl on her elbows and her knees out to us to get to this piece of plastic. And she was so weak she couldn't, and so her aunt picked her up under her arms and deposited her on this piece of plastic. And as I looked into the face of this dying, homeless woman, all I could think of was, God, what have you gotten me into? What does my faith mean to a dying homeless woman under a tree? I have no preparation for how to tell her anything that will mean anything. Fortunately, the people I was with had visited many other women like Joanna, and they showed me how to get down next to her, how to wrap my arms around her, how to put my face close to her and talk to her, and to explain to her that God had sent me to be His arms to her that day, and that my arms around her were His arms. That's a stigma. And you might think, well, yeah, that happens in other places. That doesn't happen where I live. You know, maybe if people don't know about HIV, that maybe that happens there, but it doesn't happen where I live. But it does. Just 10 miles from where I live in a city called Santa Ana is a man named Alberto, and his story was that he was disabled in a wheelchair, HIV positive, nowhere to live, and his brother allowed him to live in his backyard. And so when Alberto needed a bath, Alberto's wife would take the garden hose and hose him down with that cold water, trying to knock off the dirt and the oil from his skin. I say that in that family, the dog was treated better than Alberto because at least the dog could come in the house. The stigma around HIV is terrible. Well, here's another reason. It's because it's incurable. When I was diagnosed with cancer, at least I had a fighting chance, because not everyone who gets cancer will die from it. But see, HIV is different. Eventually, the virus will weaken a person's immune system so dramatically that after a while you can't fight off disease. And after a longer time, when the immune system has become so broken, a person is said to have AIDS and they're susceptible to strange fungi and bacteria and other viruses that healthy people can handle. Right now, there is no vaccine on the horizon to prevent it or to cure it. And so I want to be a part of a disease that has no cure. I want to bring the love of Jesus Christ, just like I want to bring it to an illness that's unexpected, where there's stigma. And I want to be part of knocking down that stigma piece at a time. I want to be a part of bringing good news to people who have an incurable disease. But here's another reason why I'm an advocate. It's because it's treatable. I mean, if the bad news is that it's incurable, the good news is that it's treatable. And life-saving medication has been discovered that will extend life. Without it, there's a 3 to 5 year expectancy. But with it, you can live 20 years or more. Look at these pictures. Here is a picture of a man who is near death. He's skeletal. He's got TB, he's got malaria, he's HIV positive and other infections that his body is broken down. He is a man near death. But this next picture shows you this man 9 months after being on these life-saving drugs. They take a man from death almost to life again. It almost looks like Lazarus, like a man who has been dead and come back to life. And this is why you don't hear very much about HIV in our country anymore, because medication is readily available. Unfortunately, it is not as easily available around the world, and it's expensive. Millions of those who could benefit from the ARVs don't have access to them. Well, I want to be a part of making sure that my brothers and sisters around the world have access to this life-saving medication. When I was diagnosed with breast cancer, if I had not had surgery and chemotherapy and radiation, I would probably be dead by now. Same with melanoma. If I had not had access to surgery that removed the cancer from my body, I would be dead. But I had treatment. And I want to make sure that my brothers, my sisters around the world have the treatment necessary to have an opportunity to live. Another reason I'm an advocate is because it's preventable. This is another piece of good news. We know how to prevent it. It's not a mystery. When I was diagnosed with cancer, I asked the doctor, what did I do wrong? Did I do this wrong? Did I not eat enough tomatoes? Did I not eat enough broccoli? I mean, what did I do? And he said, we don't know. But with HIV, we do know how it's spread. It is spread through intimate sexual contact with a person who is HIV positive. It's spread through sharing needles from someone who is using drugs, IV drugs. It's spread through tainted blood transfusions, through childbirth, through breastfeeding. But it is not spread through casual contact. See, one of the myths is that we think we can treat our way out of the pandemic. Now, this might seem to conflict with some of the news that is out there recently about how treatment is prevention, and that is so true. Those who are treated early enough in the disease, there's like a 96% reduction of their ability to transmit the disease if they are down to an undetectable level of the virus in their bloodstream. And that is fantastic news. It's what actually makes us be able to talk about this could be the beginning of the end of the pandemic. But make no mistake, we have to also prevent new infections. We must. Treatment is expensive, and behavior change always needs to be part of our message. And this is a message that the faith community can give. Well, the fifth reason that I am an advocate for people with HIV, and it's a word I made up, but it's because it's incurable, and it just means that HIV and AIDS allows an infinite number of ways for those of us who love God to demonstrate His love to people with HIV and AIDS. And as a person of faith, Jesus' model to people who were sick, the way that He related to people who were sick, gives me a model that I think transcends differences in religious beliefs. How did Jesus respond to physical illness? Well, Mark 1, verses 40 to 42, it says, a man with leprosy came to Him and begged Him on his knees, if you are willing, you can make me clean. Filled with compassion, Jesus reached out His hand and touched the man. I am willing, He said, be clean. Immediately the leprosy left him and he was cured. See, lepers in that day, in case you don't know it, they lived lives of isolation and stigma. They were outcast. They had to shout to everyone as they approached someone else, unclean, unclean. I mean, they lived ostracized from everyone else. They could not be around people who were not lepers. They had to live on the edge of town. Their skin began to ooze as the nerve endings would die, as from what we now know as Hansen's disease, and the nerve endings would die, and they couldn't feel. And so they would, just what would be a bump to us might turn into something with gangrene, and there were body parts, their fingers and their toes and the end of their nose and their ears, they would lose them because of injury. And so they would try to wrap up their skin sometimes to try to hide the fact that they were diseased. And it got to the place that in many cases it was only their families who would still care, maybe even just the moms who would come and bring them something to eat. And so lepers lived a tragic life. And everybody assumed that they had done something wrong, that they had this secret unconfessed sin, and that's why they were lepers. And so they lived not only with a disease, but they lived with stigma. They lived with people's hatred. They lived with the ostracization of their community. But in this particular story, there is a man, a leper. We don't know how long he's been a leper, but he hears about Jesus. He hears about this guy who's out there healing every sort of disease. And he decides, maybe he could heal me. And so he braves the crowd, he braves the cursing and the fear, he braves the rejection of others as he calls out as he walks through the community, unclean, unclean, and the crowds part, and yet he kept going till he found Jesus. And how did Jesus respond? Well, Jesus did three things. He cared. The Bible says that he was filled with compassion. Jesus' heart broke as he looked at this leper. He wasn't filled with revulsion or distaste. He didn't want to go ick or yuck. He was filled with compassion. Now, I realize that some of you might be thinking, and I'm going to go here with you because this is the way I used to think, and I think we might as well just be honest about it. Some of you might be thinking, but if we know how it's spread, and if people knowingly put themselves at risk, then it's their fault if they get sick. Why should I care about people when they're being stupid or they're taking unnecessary risks? Lepers, as I said, were assumed to have a secret unconfessed sin. Else why would they be sick? And the truth is, yes, you can become HIV positive through immoral choices. But even so, what should our response be? Should our response be predicated on how someone became sick, or should our response be predicated on the fact that somebody needs help? I mean, for instance, if I were driving down the highway, the expressway outside of my office at night, and I saw a car flashing by me without its lights, and they were going 100 miles an hour, I might think to myself, the person driving that car is taking enormous risks. They're going to get in an accident. Let's just say that's true. Let's just say I drive a little further down the road and I actually come across that car that had been speeding and didn't have its lights on at night. And yes, there's an accident and their bodies spread all over the ground and people are bleeding and they're in need. Can you really imagine yourself or anybody walking up to them and saying, you were stupid. I'm not going to help you. You put yourself at risk. We wouldn't do that. We would grab our cell phones. We would cradle those sick and dying, those injured people, and we would say to them, I will hold you until help gets here. I won't leave you. Or how about you're in the hospital visiting a friend who's had a heart attack? Can you imagine standing over your friend and saying to your friend, what did you do wrong? I told you to quit eating all those cheeseburgers. If you had just left off the fries, you wouldn't be laying in this hospital bed. We don't do that. We don't do that with anybody. What makes us think it's okay to talk to people who are HIV positive that way? See, Jesus never asked anyone how they got sick. He didn't look at the leper and say, what did you do? What was your secret unconfessed sin? If you don't tell me what you did, I'm not going to help you. He just said, how can I help? His heart was filled with compassion. Let's just say that everybody in the entire world who is HIV positive because of choices or decisions or actions or behavior. Let's just say it's something they brought on themselves. They put themselves in a situation in which they could become positive. Let's just say everybody is that way. if your response to that is, then I don't want to have anything to do with it. I have compassion for the person who's a victim. I have compassion for the woman whose husband brought HIV home. I have compassion for the child who was born to an HIV positive mom. I have compassion for the person who was raped or victim of incest. I have compassion for a person who received a tainted blood transfusion. Let's just say if that's your response, then you don't understand the heart of God. You are not thinking the same way Jesus did, because his heart was filled with compassion. Well, the second thing that Jesus did is he touched. He touched the man. He was God. He could have just spoken a word from across the room, from across the field, and that man would have been healed. He didn't have to touch him, but he did. Physical touch is such a powerful instrument for conveying care. And we have that opportunity to touch people who are HIV positive, to let them know that they are worthwhile, that they are valuable, that they are loved. I don't know if you've ever had the flu, the kind of flu where you're like throwing your guts up and you're just like, really nasty. You are throwing up and it's gross and you're sweaty and your hair's hanging in mats and you smell because you've got fever and you're sweating and vomit smells terrible. And if somebody walks up, somebody who loves you, walks up to you and puts their hand on your shoulder or brings you a cup of water or a cloth, a cool cloth to touch your face, you feel loved even though you are so sick and so vulnerable and don't feel particularly human. That's the opportunity that we have for people who are positive, modeling our behavior after Jesus, who touched. And then he healed. The third thing that Jesus did is he healed the man. He didn't leave him weak and sick. He removed the leprosy from him. You and I don't often get to be a part of bringing physical healing. I always pray for someone who is HIV positive. I always pray and ask God to heal them physically. That's God's business. He's the healer, not me. But whether or not he heals someone from HIV, if he removes the virus or not, you and I have the opportunity to participate in offering emotional and spiritual healing to every person who is positive. Now, you might think that a person with HIV, you might think that their greatest need is for medication or for physical healing. But I believe that there is an even deeper need, and that is to know the one who made them and loves them and longs to be in a relationship with them, to let them know that they are not alone. When I had breast cancer, you might think that my greatest need was to be physically healed, and while I wanted to be physically healed, and while I pray that I never have cancer again, my deepest need was to be in relationship with the God who made me, the God who created me, the God whose I am, the God to whom I belong. And so the person with HIV or AIDS that you meet, have contact with, their greatest need is not physical, it is spiritual, to know that God has not abandoned them. Their greatest need is to know that they have not been forgotten. That woman under the tree, Joanna, yes, I wish that I could have healed her. I wish that I could have brought her medication that would have restored her to life. I so wanted that. I couldn't. I didn't have that power to do that. But her greatest need was to know that she had not been forgotten by God, and that there was a home for her in heaven, that even though this life had been terribly difficult, painful, and with a lot of suffering, there was life beyond this life, and there was a Savior who loved her. So you and I must do what Jesus did. He cared, he was compassionate, he touched, and he healed. And that's our responsibility, to care, to respond with compassion, to touch physically, to hug, to kiss, to embrace, to hold, and to heal. We might not be able to physically heal, but we can certainly be a part of someone's spiritual healing. And we offer ourselves in the exact same way that Jesus did. He came and he offered himself, and he offered us his presence, and then he carried our pain. And we do the same. We bring ourselves into the lives of people who are positive, and we bring our presence. We bring our very selves. And then we offer to help carry pain that isn't ours. And when we do, we offer the most concrete reality that there is a God who loves them. We become Jesus with skin on him. We make the invisible God visible. That's why I'm an advocate for people with HIV.